Hello, welcome to Tips and Tricks for Courageous Conversations. My name is Ann Henriques, and I'm an Adult Services Librarian at Berlin-Peck Memorial Library.
I'm Kim McNally, and I'm the Library Director at Berlin-Peck.
Courageous Conversations is a program we created in 2022, where a small group of people gather to discuss important and often divisive political and social issues in an open and supportive environment. After about a year of hosting these conversations in our library, we offered this course in the skills and practices we use in our conversations for those who are new or those who wanted a refresher.
Whether you're someone who usually avoids talking about politics with others or someone who's happy to share your opinion on any and all topics, this presentation is for you. We hope that these tips will help you engage in your own courageous conversations that yield stronger, deeper connections with the people in your life.
Why should I try to talk to someone who disagrees with me? Decrease polarization, increase empathy, understanding of issues and engagement, strengthen connection, change your expectations, change the outcome, connection rather than agreement, understanding of other viewpoints. We've all heard and seen the effects of the increasing polarization in politics in recent years. And in case you're thinking that it's limited to those who work in politics and doesn't really affect you personally, I would say that there's increasing evidence of how this polarization reaches into social settings outside of the political realm. In fact, the National Institute for Civil Discourse at the University of Arizona Tucson has seen a surge in requests since 2016 to intervene in situations where political rancor is turning family members, church congregants, and co-workers against one another. We see evidence of this all around us, maybe even across the dinner table, and the divides we feel are only heightened by media, some of which flourish and profit by fueling anger towards the other side. We can't expect an outside agency to solve this problem for us. We have to get in there and do the work of reaching out and making connections with others in our communities. And that's why we're here today.
A second reason that you should talk to someone who disagrees with you is that doing so can help increase your empathy for others, improve your understanding of the issues, and help you be more engaged, which leads to decreased feelings of helplessness. When we know people as individuals, rather than just us and them, we frequently learn that we're more similar than we may seem. We can see ourselves in their shoes and start to understand how they've come to where they are in their own lives. Think of a person or experience that helped you understand a different way of life or culture. What was it that gave you greater perspective? How did that new perspective lead to a different understanding? Did you act differently after gaining a new perspective? Feel free to pause this video. Another benefit of engaging with others is that we frequently learn that issues are more complex than we initially thought, which can lead to new insights.
Strengthen connection. When you listen and build empathy for others, you also increase the likeliness of strengthening connection. Right now, loneliness is a serious problem in the U.S. We are increasingly separated physically and emotionally. By one recent estimate, 2 out of 3 working adults consider themselves lonely. Making connections with others, especially real-time, in-person connections through time spent together by doing shared activities or by talking, combats feelings of loneliness.
Because connection is so important, you may need to adjust your thinking about what the experience of talking to someone who disagrees with you will look or feel like. You may already be familiar with the way in which the expectations we have going into an experience can completely change how we feel about the outcome. A funny example of this is the ridiculous complaints that some travelers make. Things like, Stonehenge is just a bunch of rocks in a field. Or the family that was disappointed in their skiing holiday because it was assumed they'd know how to ski. As an outsider, it's easy to see that it was the difference between expectations and reality that left people feeling disappointed. Even in your daily life, you've probably experienced the feeling of being pleasantly surprised when you went to a party expecting it to be boring and instead actually had a good time. Or the reverse, having high hopes for a vacation and feeling let down when things didn't go as planned. Our conversations are the same. When we hope to have a deep, meaningful conversation with a loved one and it turns into conflict instead, we feel doubly disappointed. Instead, we can, to some extent, change the outcome by changing our expectations. Rather than trying to reach agreement, which may never happen, we can choose to seek understanding and connection. Think, what can I learn about this person? How can I understand them more, and what experiences have led them to where they are now? Where do our experiences and opinions connect? I recently had an experience with a neighbor, and I went over to ask to borrow an egg. We got into conversation, and we don't always see eye to eye on things. But during the conversation, the other person said to me, "Wow, I hadn't thought of it that way." And isn't that exactly where we'd like to get when we have a courageous conversation?
With these things in mind, how do I start? Start with yourself first. Analyze your blind spots, take off your team jersey, find your why, watch your tone, step back and get perspective, and ask yourself, what's my goal? Are you willing to truly listen to someone whose opinions you strongly oppose? If not, consider why not. What do you fear?
Ask yourself this: what have I been accepting as fact or truth without recognizing that there is probably more, or even a lot more, that I don't know about this topic? An example of this came up in our group conversation about prisons. A participant talked about how she'd always had total faith that the justice system works until she read a memoir of an innocent man placed on death row and ultimately exonerated. In that book, she saw a list of the men and women currently on death row and the statistic that 1 in 10 is innocent. That experience caused her to question the belief she'd always held and recognize that there was plenty she didn't know about the justice system. It's this very openness to changing your mind that Ralph Nichols, the father of listening studies, advocates. He advises listening for evidence that you might be wrong rather than listening to poke holes in the other person's argument, much less plugging your ears or cutting someone out of your life entirely. It requires a certain generosity of spirit, but if you remain open to the possibility that you might be wrong, or at least not entirely right, you'll get far more out of the conversation.
Take off your team jersey. Hey Kim, what do you see in this picture?
Well, I see a team dressed alike, they're unified, they all have the common purpose of playing a sport.
This picture represents all the ways in which we treat our own political parties as a team and adopt a team-first mindset in politics. Those who disagree with the team aren't team players. If someone doesn't toe the party line and follow the team, we punish them. We talk about Hail Mary passes, game changers, and knockout punches. We speak of us versus them, or our team versus their team. Consider this. When you identify yourself with a team, how easily do you give yourself a break from figuring out what you think and believe and just trust that what your group tells you is what you should agree with? Are you more willing to overlook the things that go against your own personal convictions to go with your team or political party? What perspectives or ideas have you ignored because it came from, quote, the other team? In order to have a courageous conversation, we have to take off our team jerseys and recognize when we're letting the team or party speak for us rather than us speaking for ourselves.
The next step in preparing yourself is to find your why. Why do you want to talk about these issues? Why is it important for you or your relationships? During a conversation, it's also important to watch your tone. I'm sure you're keenly aware of how tone can lead to success or failure in an interaction. You can probably think of instances where the tone that someone directed at you rather than the words they said made your blood boil. As you engage in conversation, create a little emotional distance and channel your inner talk show host. Would Barbara Walters be sarcastic with one of her guests? Instead, try to remove yourself from an emotional reaction and take a neutral tone.
It's also important to step back and get perspective. Do you have a strong reaction to something you've heard, read, or seen because of the way it's presented to you? Is someone trying to provoke a reaction? What's the bigger picture? Consider the issue of transgender youth in sports. If someone presents the issue of transgender youth participating in sports as causing serious harm to girls and young women who have traditionally struggled to gain acceptance, funding, and status in the sports arena, how does that influence the way you approach the issue? If instead you are told about the personal stories of a very small number of youth who statistically are already vulnerable to bullying, mental health problems, and face serious challenges with self and social acceptance, does that change your perspective? This is a complex issue that requires nuance and serious consideration, but it was making a personal connection and the empathy that resulted from that connection that caused Utah Republican State Senator Daniel Thatcher to change his perspective on this issue and go against his own party. Talking with and understanding the pain and difficulties that transgender youth and their families face led him to a place of more compassion and rethinking his original position.
Finally, what's your goal? Is your goal understanding? Is your goal to improve a relationship by having deeper conversations? That's great, then you're ready to talk. But if your goal is to convince the other person of your viewpoint or to get your own point across, tread carefully.
How do I know if the other person is willing to talk? First, assess the situation. Is the time or location conducive to a deeper talk? Are you both calm and relaxed? If the situation is busy or stressful, you'll both have trouble. Arrange another time to get together. Secondly, ask them if they want to talk. When an issue comes up in conversation, say, I don't really agree with that, but I'd like to hear more about what you think. Would you like to do that? So you've decided to talk. Now what?
Curiosity versus judgment. Often we judge someone because we assume that they think like we do and are disappointed when they don't. Or we may feel personally attacked and respond defensively. Instead, approach the issue with curiosity. Ask them, why do you think that? What are the benefits or drawbacks of this approach? What don't I know about this? In conversations, try to think like a scientist. What does this mean? It means we should always be on the lookout for new insights into situations and issues. A true scientist is just as happy to have their own theory disproved as proved. Did you discover that what you previously thought wasn't actually true in the way you thought it was? Great, you just learned something entirely new. Ask open-ended questions that are as neutral as possible. Good questions don't begin with, wouldn't you agree? Or, don't you think? Or, isn't it true? These questions make assumptions and close down responses. Tell me more. This phrase can be very powerful. It communicates that you're open and want to hear what your conversation partner has to say. By starting from a place of compassion, your partner feels seen and heard. Not only will you develop your own listening skills, but the act of listening to another often leads others to be more open to listening to you in the same way, something I think we all appreciate. You're also likely to learn something new. I personally use this phrase often when I'm in conversation. Recently, someone said, I love when you say, tell me more. I feel seen.
Listening does not equal agreement, and listening to a different viewpoint won't hurt you. To quote from Kate Murphy, listening simply means you accept the legitimacy of the other person's point of view and that you might have something to learn from it. It also means that you embrace the possibility that there might be multiple truths, and understanding them all might lead to a larger truth. Understanding can always be improved. If you find yourself reacting negatively to something you hear, pause. Ask yourself, why am I reacting this way? What could this conversation be like without my reaction? You do you. Also remember that you don't have to have an intellectual or emotional stake in the other person's thoughts or feelings. Because they say it and you listen, it doesn't mean that you think it too. If you can't find common ground, keep it neutral and employ the inner talk show host we mentioned previously. Conduct a kind, respectful interview. When did you first start to think of this issue this way? What led you to this belief? What do you think the biggest challenges are for this issue in your future? Recognize generalizations and assumptions. Why do we make generalizations? Firstly, it's how our brains work. Being aware that we have that tendency helps us also be sensitive to when those generalizations can be problematic. Don't assume you know why a person thinks, feels, or does what they do. Ask questions instead. Does this generalization apply to this situation or person? Who is harmed by it? Who is helped? If someone makes an assumption about you, say, I understand why you think that I support XYZ, but my perspective is different. A common generalization is that people on public assistance are lazy or happy to take handouts rather than work. The reality is that most on public assistance either struggle to work because of age, disability, or childcare difficulty, or are already working at jobs that don't pay enough to support them or their families. Why might it be easier to lump all these people into one group?
I recently experienced something with my young friend who is 9. She explained to me that at school she learned the ABC method when she's having a conversation with someone that she doesn't agree with. So first, A, you accept what the person has said. B, you build it up. And then C, you challenge it. So for example, someone says to you, the exit sign over the door is big. Well, you don't necessarily think it's big, but you want to accept what the person has said. So yes, there is a sign over the door. And then you want to build it up. The letters are large. But to challenge it, you might say, the letters are bright red, so anyone can see them. This is a wonderful skill for people of all ages to learn. Next, a word about vulnerability and getting comfortable with being uncomfortable. Again, from Kate Murphy, quote, it's an issue of trusting that you can be imperfect in the conversation. Listening is a matter of you deciding you don't need to worry what to say next. The irony is that by remaining defensive and not listening fully, you actually increase your chances of responding inappropriately or insensitively. The more you think about the right thing to say, the more you miss, and the more likely it is that you'll say the wrong thing when it's your turn. Pause if you need to after the other person concludes to think about what you want to say, end quote. Real, deep conversations include vulnerability, and that's hard for all of us. Speak from your own experience rather than trying to represent a group, and use I statements. I feel that, or I think that. Good conversations also embrace both and thinking rather than either or thinking. Pay attention to when you're being offered only 2 choices, which is a false binary choice. There are almost always more than that, even when it comes to ice cream flavors, but we're often told that we must be this way or that way. You're pro-baby or pro-woman. You're for national security or you're for easier immigration. When we embrace complexity, we recognize that there are many more options. You can be both at the same time. I can support people's rights to have their basic needs met through a welfare system, but also support people who are working to provide for themselves. What you may notice is that almost all of this that we've been talking about focuses on you. To a certain extent, what you bring into this process is what you'll get out of it.
For our conversations, we took many of these important principles and distilled them into 4 agreements that could be easily shared and understood before beginning a conversation. We highlight that understanding and connection are the goal rather than agreement, and that we have to start from a place of openness and willingness to listen to others. We focus on good listening skills that start from a place of curiosity rather than judgment, and we actively look for places of connection and for what we can learn about other perspectives. Thirdly, we recognize that this is a vulnerable and often uncomfortable process, so it's important that we speak truthfully about our own experiences and know that others will respect that. Finally, we practice that both and kind of thinking when we recognize that there's more than one answer, and while we may disagree with others, it doesn't make us or them any less valuable as people. If you want a quick cheat sheet to review after you finish this video, this is it.
Let's talk about some of the concerns people have that keep them from engaging with others. What if they say something offensive? Scenario 1, someone tells an offensive joke. We recommend responding as if you don't understand. Say, I don't get it. Why is that funny? Why do this rather than slamming the person for being a racist, sexist, or something else? First, you're taking a more neutral stance towards the person rather than responding negatively, even if you feel very negative. Second, you're giving the other person an opportunity to think through what they just said and perhaps question why they've repeated or told this offensive joke. This creates an opportunity for further talk.
Scenario 2. They use an offensive term. Imagine this. An elderly father is talking to his son, and he mentions, quote, the Oriental couple who lives next door, end quote. The son instantly yells at him and calls him a racist, and the father is hurt, not understanding what he did wrong. Days later, the son again listens to his father talk, this time about how he ate dinner with the neighbors and about how they were helping each other out. The son realizes that he'd assumed something about his father that was really just ignorance of terminology. It's important to know that what is accepted terminology changes over time, and we're probably all going to use the wrong terminology in one situation or another. So we start by being gentle with one another and trying to correct with kindness. Here's an example of how to do this. Kim, I cannot believe I got gypped by that guy on eBay.
And did you know that term gypped comes from the belief that gypsies were untrustworthy liars who would always cheat you? I learned recently that they refer to themselves as Roma or Romani because gypsy was a term that other people made up about them based on a misunderstanding of where they came from, kind of like Native Americans being called Indians. Other examples include Indian giver, pimp, homosexual. If you find that use of offensive terms or jokes isn't due to ignorance, and the person you're speaking to persists in using language that's offensive, what should you do? First, call it out kindly. You should never resort to name calling. Instead, let them know why the language they've used is hurtful to you and others. Say, I find that language hurtful because, or did you know that term is offensive to many people because?
When should I stop a conversation? There may come a time when the right choice is to stop a conversation. First off, definitely end a conversation if you're having trouble listening. Again, from Kate Murphy, not listening because you don't agree with someone, you are self-absorbed, or you think you already know what someone will say, makes you a bad listener. But not listening because you don't have the intellectual or emotional energy to listen at that moment makes you human. Secondly, if your emotions are getting the better of you, be upfront about it. Let your partner know that you need some time to calm down and ask to talk later. Finally, you should never continue to engage in conversation with someone who's using abusive language towards you or who attacks you personally.
Now back to you. We're sharing a cartoon that we got from the book Think Again. How to acquire wisdom. Number 1, live. Number 2, make mistakes. Number 3, learn from your mistakes. Number 4, repeat steps 1 through 3 until wisdom is acquired. Number 5, realize that the wisdom you acquired in step 4 was not really wisdom at all. This realization brings new wisdom. Number 6, repeat steps 1 through 5 for the rest of your life. We think this explains the lifelong process of gaining understanding. This ability to engage in deep conversations with others who think differently isn't a stamp that you'll get when finishing this video or after having one successful conversation. This is a lifelong process during which we continue to embrace nuance in all situations. Nuance means finding the subtleties in arguments, being open to shades of gray, and moving past political talking points. We also think of nuance as the lifelong practice of asking painful, difficult questions, questions that might reveal something new or bring a position into different relief or otherwise illuminate our perspectives. Taking care with the language we use, recognizing that human life is messy and we need to bring the mess into the discussion. It's also extending understanding and grace to others, saying, I don't know how to answer that, accepting when you're wrong, learning something new and moving on, and repeating it throughout your life. Think of an experience in your own life or a friend's, maybe a health or legal problem. What are the complexities involved that you didn't understand before you were in it? For example, it's easy to say the justice system works when you've never had to actually interact with that system. We assume bad people go to jail and get punished. However, when we see examples of people being exonerated after years in prison, or see wealthy people punished less harshly because they can afford better legal representation, what do? We can ignore it, or we can take the more challenging step to question it and our own assumptions of that system. What parts of this system really aren't working? Can good people do bad things? Is someone who's done one or two really terrible things a bad person? We've now covered the basic tools and strategies that will help you enter into courageous conversations with others. We hope that this video will be a tool that you can refer to whenever you need a refresher.
We'd like to leave you with a final thought from Sarah Stewart Holland and Beth Silvers, authors of Now What and hosts of the podcast Pantsuit Politics. The goal is not, and has never been, to have one grace-filled conversation, dust off our hands and say, fixed it. We strengthen connection not by agreeing or resolving tension. We strengthen connection by recognizing that our unique identities are what bring us together. We honor the specialness of each human being, be it our parent or our president, by letting it exist and not demanding conformity. We honor the divine in others and in ourselves. This does not mean condoning differences that are harmful in pursuit of agreement. It just means acknowledging that agreement cannot be the goal in a planet as big and diverse as ours. It can't even be the goal inside a partnership between two people. Connection is the goal, because connection is the reality, even in the face of the most challenging political controversies of our age. And conversation, not to solve conflict, but to recognize that connection, can get us closer.
We'd like to express our thanks for these authors from whom we've learned almost all of what we shared with you today. I Think You're Wrong, But I'm Listening, A Guide to Grace-Filled Political Conversations by Sarah Stewart Holland and Beth Silvers. Beyond Your Bubble, How to Connect Across the Political Divide, Skills and Strategies for Conversations That Work by Tanya Israel. Think Again, The Power of Knowing What You Don't Know by Adam Grant. You're Not Listening, What You're Missing and Why It Matters by Kate Murphy. And finally, Now What? How to Move Forward When We're Divided About Basically Everything by Sarah Stewart Holland and Beth Silvers. We highly encourage you to check out some of these books if you're interested in learning more. We also invite you to watch our follow-up video on why changing your own or someone else's opinions is so difficult. There'll be a link to that video in the notes. And finally, thank you for watching.